Okay, so now we can begin. Welcome to the Reuben H. Fleet Science Center for another Exploring Ethics program for the Center for Ethics in Science and Technology. My name is Mike Kalichman. I'm co-director of the center. And as I think all of you know by now, if only by reading the program for tonight, this is our public event to celebrate the 5-year anniversary of the Ethics Center. And before I say anything more, it would be good to just get a quick show of hands on a couple of things. So how many of you are here for the first time tonight? So relatively few. So that's in a certain way a good sign, because that means the rest of you are here because you thought it was worth coming back again. Tonight's program will be a little bit different than the programs we've had before. Our interest is not just to have an opportunity to hear a wonderful speaker, which we will, but also to use that as a jumping off point to think more about what the center should be. So by being here tonight, you can help us think about the future of the Ethics Center and where we're going to go in the next 5 years. So having said that, I know that many of you have come to the center and its activities at a later stage, so I'm going to just give a couple of moments of brief history about the centers so you know where we started. And part of that start includes one of our speaker tonight, because she was part of those early stages. So, as I said, we are reaching our 5th anniversary now. The center really began the year before 5 years ago, in 2003, when the president of the Legler-Benbow Foundation recognized that some of the areas of research that he was funding were highly controversial. One of those areas included taking human embryonic stem cells and putting them into a mouse embryo, and then allowing that embryo to grow in a mouse. So some people might look at that and ask questions about whether or not you'd have the possibility of a small human growing in the mouse. Another area of research that they were funding was looking at creating robot-like devices that would have intelligence designed in a way that those robots would learn to do things rather than simply be told what to do. And to the extent that they would get better and better at that, we would be moving in the direction of having robots that would be moving closer and closer to human functioning. Pete Ellsworth's worry was that there was nobody discussing those issues, and his worry came at a time when Larry Hinman from the University of San Diego, Sarah Burke at UCSD, and I were all talking about the need to have a public conversation about ethics in science and technology. So fortunately, we all came together, held our first event in 2003 to ask some leaders of the community what we should do, and based on that, we subsequently founded a center the following year. In the early years, the first 2 or 3 years of the center, our primary focus was stem cells. And I'm sure by now all of you have heard plenty, if not too much, about human embryonic stem cell research and some of the ethical questions that go with it. After we started getting our foot in the door with stem cell research, we found other areas that were as important, or perhaps in some ways more important, to address. We talked about the Terry Schiavo case and end-of-life decision-making. We talked about other aspects of the brain and neuroethics. We got into the computer science and information technology area. And then thanks to one of the members of our board of advisors, who it turns out is here tonight, that's Nancy Vaughn, we got a better insight into the direction we should be going with future programs, and that was that we needed to find a venue where we could meet once each month, same place, easy parking, unlike UC San Diego or San Diego State University, a place that was recognizable to the community. And fortunately, the Reuben H. Fleet Science Center agreed to be a partner with us to allow us to have our programs here monthly, which we've now been doing since May of last year, quite successfully in many ways. And that's, as many of you know, now includes a partnership with KPBS, where we typically have an interview with them in advance of the program related to the topic of that month. And we also have op-eds that come out frequently. So we now have a place to talk about different topics. And we've, if you look at the schedules for the past year and a half, we've covered quite a few different topics now. So where we're going with this is we want to figure out what we should be doing in the next 5 years. We certainly are already starting to do some things in conjunction with the San Diego Science Fair and the San Diego Science Festival to try and bring ethics into those conversations. But we're going to be asking you in the latter part of this evening's program to help us thinking about where we should go next. And those are the 3 questions that you found on your chairs when you sat down. We're going to actually ask you to work in small groups to answer those questions and feed back to us afterwards. But to prepare you for that, we are really fortunate to have one of the speakers we had early on for the Ethics Center, Laurie Zoloth. We had invited her here for that same proverbial topic, stem cells. She was here a number of times, I think, in San Diego to speak about stem cell research. Laurie, as you can see from your program, has from her biography, has quite a prestigious background and far too many positions and titles to possibly have time to work on all of them. But a few that aren't necessarily all on your list that I think are particularly noteworthy is that Laurie is past president of one of the most important societies in this country for dealing with bioethics issues, the American Society for Bioethics and Humanities. She has served for a number of years in a variety of capacities with NASA, in particular with their National Advisory Council and their Planetary Protection Advisory Committee. And in those roles, she is helping to think about what we're doing out in the universe, trying to find new planets and new worlds, and whether we should even be doing that. She is a founding board member and currently serves on the board of the International Society for Stem Cell Research, an international organization looking at what we should be doing and how we should be doing it with stem cells. And I now know she is previously with the Howard Hughes Medical Institute's Bioethics Advisory Board, up until recently. And many other ways. She's highly recommended for what we're going to be talking about tonight. Does tremendous research and thinking about ethics issues. So she's going to give you a presentation, and after she's done, we'll have a little bit of time for question and answer, break into small groups, and then reconvene at the end. So I want to welcome Laurie Zoloth. Thank you, Laurie. That's right. So this one.
Fall asleep on me like my undergraduates? You in the back, stay away. Great, okay. So first of all, happy anniversary, Ethics Center. You are very fortunate in Chicago, in San Diego, because in Chicago, we don't have one group that is really the representative of ethics, science, and technology in the way that you do in San Diego. It's a real advance. It has something to do with the sunny California disposition. I'm a Californian, not a Midwesterner. And I know that, in fact, putting together a center like this and having it be the kind of nationally important center that Mike has been able, and other colleagues who help him, but have really led the way, it's a very considerable achievement. These are hard times. He's done a terrific job, and the production and the writing and the public face of science in Chicago, in San Diego, and I keep doing this all night, is really terrific, and I'm very impressed. And so happy birthday, first of all. That's the second. And secondly, you're all here, and that is important to me, and I'm going to talk about why, in fact, your presence in science, the public voice in science, all the way from meetings such as this, from the early meetings at Salk, all the way through to the way that Californians have led the way in terms of funding and intellectual support for stem cell research, is perhaps the single most important gesture that we could hope for if we're building an ethical science. So my question is to push you one step further, because when he called and said he wanted to talk about the next 5 years, it became an opportunity for me to think about, this is great, happy birthday, celebration, but what can I push forward? What's the next step? And I want to ask a hard question. Can research, as it unfolds, be fair? And what does that mean? So not only should science be ethical, I'm going to up the demand and say it won't be ethical unless it's fair. If, in fact, and here's my claim, if we did fabulous work and came up with a very important cures using human embryonic stem cell research, it would not be ethical unless it was fairly distributed, unless it's a technology that's available really to everyone. If it's another high-tech, boutique, only for the privileged technology, I would change from being a supporter of it to a really sharp critic of it. Because unless it's fair, It is not ethical. Now, that's a big statement. Let me try to back it up. Here's my plan. I'm first going to talk about why basic research has to do with justice, has to do with healthcare reform, which is the American topic. It's not going to be a detailed policy talk about healthcare reform. Believe me, I could give that. I don't want to. And we've all become experts on some of the different plans, but I want to think about science and research science in light of some very hard cases and try to say, let's ask the question, how do we decide what's fair? Let's ask a different sort of question. And then I'm going to give, at the end, a quick comment on some of these unasked questions in healthcare reform and try to say to you, this is one reason why we have to not only change healthcare delivery, we have to change the production of healthcare. And that has to begin in the lab. If it's going to end in the bedside fairly, it's got to begin in the labs fairly. All right. So at Northwestern, we teach and research questions of ethics and science. And the questions that I want to think about, and if any of you have studied Immanuel Kant, you know that Kant has 5 big questions. And my questions are somewhat like Immanuel Kant's. But there's an important other two that he didn't think about. The first one is, what is humanity? What does it mean to be human? Now, Mike alluded to that when he talked about, is the mouse with human embryonic stem cells in its brain human or not? Is the little thinking robot human or not? That is one of the big questions in science today. One of the ways we talk about human, not human, is in terms of science, right? And in philosophy, we ask the same questions. Second important question I think there is to think about is, what does it mean to be free? What does it mean to be a bearer of rights? What does it mean to be free? And when you think about science, what's the core question? Think of neuroethics. How bound am I to my hormonal state, to my amygdala response? How free am I of my genetic codes? Am I predisposed to act or talk or be violent or be sad or happy in certain ways? Can it be interfered with just with drugs? Who has the power to control that? Am I free? Can I be a moral actor in the face of all we know about the capacity of our brains to deceive us? Interesting second question. But the third question that is shared by science and by philosophy is, I think, this one. It's not just research. It's medical research. What must I do about the suffering of others? Now, Kant didn't ask that question. But I believe that science must ask that question. We live in a world of brokenness. That's what calls stem cell research into being, in some sense. How do we heal? How do we change the world? And that's really a big question behind many of the questions of science. That's the point of it. The final one is one that we struggle with all the time. Scientists, philosophers, citizens who are interested in it all, how do I live decently in a world that we know isn't fair? In a world that has, yes, wonderful things going on, but also needs a radical critique of evil. It's a hard world. It hasn't gone exactly as we would want at all times. How do you live decently in a world like that? Now, policy actually asks us to make moral choices that are based on answers like this. So we have stories that are good stories for us. We're reminded of how you deal with suffering others when you read something like the Good Samaritan, or in the Quran, or in the text of Hebrew scriptures, or in the text of the Hindu Upanishads. How do you treat, love, care for your neighbor is a concern of many of our moral narratives. And all of these stories are important because they tell us, what do we do? How do we judge? How do we make a decision between right and wrong? And all of these questions, all of these narratives infuse science as well. We may not think they do, but there is always a moral narrative behind every human gesture, including science. The ethics of basic research assumes that science doesn't have a moral story, but it does. The trouble is that ethicists who critique it so far in bioethics, we proceed as if the only problem, the only question we'd ask the public is, do we have your permission to do it? Or is it unjustified? Is it justified research, or is it unjustified research? It's not the only question. but we often proceed as if the only problem is the permission. It's often carried out in conditions of relative abundance. It's often hard for us to judge the validity or worth of scientific research or projects in the developing world. How do we know? How do we judge? We have the labs of the UC system, right? Even the budget crunch are so far beyond the labs of most developing world countries, it's not even close. And thirdly, often we talk in ethics as if describing something accurately is the goal. Just understanding what the mouse is, what a stem cell is, what the moral status of human embryo is, just describing it would be enough, when actually it's not enough. There's also a goal, a telos. And there's also not enough. We call this the problem of the third in philosophy and in policy. The question is, the Good Samaritan only goes so far. What would really happen? Larry Churchill raises this in 1996. If this Good Samaritan had a lot of wounded travelers by the road, who is the world made for? What sort of world does science make? And for whom? How do we proceed in basic science? You're in a lab, and there's many things to choose. Which experiment do you choose? So here I want to raise the question of justice in science. There's not an answer to this. But here's where public participation, I think, could make a huge difference. How do we decide what is just? When we know there's not enough, how do you justly distribute scarce goods and resources? Anyone who has children, more than one, knows that there's never enough. And our earliest considerations have to do with how do we make that which we have fairly shared. In light of healthcare, in particular, when we've decided to fund in particular ways that don't include everyone, what are the language of such choices? And that, colleagues, is what the August fights was about. People coming to town hall meetings and saying, I have little enough in my Medicare or my Medicaid. I have little enough in my Blue Cross plan. Don't take it away from me. And behind the panic, the moral panic, was this notion of scarcity. Should scientists have to worry about this? And how do they worry about this? How can whole states be accountable for justice? And even if we got it right in America, what are we to do about the developing world, as I mentioned before? So, many different issues call for justice. So let me just give you a quick one about why I think it comes, how this works out. So the first question is, we get a great idea, right? And who should test it? Now here's a little talk about a website, right, called Just Another Lab Rat, justanotherlabrat.org, and a guy named Paul Clough, who is a professional volunteer. And it turns out that around every major medical center, there is a group of people who volunteer for testing of drugs. And they get paid, right? He says 10,000 volunteers in the US who can be considered professional volunteers. They do 3 or 4 large studies a year, and they earn more than $20,000 a year. Now, supposedly, you're supposed to wait for one study to clear of a drug before you go sign on to the next study. But there's no monitoring of this. And you can go to different centers, and people make a tidy amount of money. Now, it would be one thing if it's just, you know, testing it. But now, in stem cell research, one of the things that's happened upping the ante is in some New York states, because some places are now offering money for the actual body part, the actual egg, at $10,000. Should women be able to sell their eggs for $10,000? This is not a donation with payment. This is, in addition to all your costs, a payment for the egg itself. Now, lest you think it's a small problem, I've actually been doing a new research project. Gil, don't know what this might. This is a new project where I'm interviewing people who are egg donors, or they call themselves egg donors, and they're in the state of California, and they're actually getting paid thousands of dollars. And it turned out that one young woman who reported to me her story talked about what she used her money for. And she says, you know, you can really make a lot of money. It's $10,000, $15,000 a cycle, and no one checks, and you can keep doing it over and over again. She has used her money to get a breast job, actually, her breasts redone. And I've actually took the time to speak to their mothers of these egg donors to talk about the complexities of their having grandchildren that they don't know, right? And what that is about. And guess what? Who are these women? They're the poor. They're people who are secretaries or who have other marginal jobs or waitresses. They're not wealthy women. This isn't how wealthy people spend their time. So here is a justice issue in the heart of basic research. Should it be one that we looked at? Who do we test? Who do we test on? The second big question is, after we test these drugs or test these ideas, who gets access to what's produced? Okay? So if we test using the bodies of the poor, who's getting it? Where's the disease burden in the world? Now here's a map of one disease burden. It's respiratory diseases. Look how that map is erased. Who dies from the diseases? Well, people in the poor, the southern part of the world, the developing world, tend to get the diseases, but they're not the focus of the research, because here you can see, here's the percentage of loss based on the global population, right? And notice that the poorest 20% of the global population bears the brunt of communicable diseases, maternal, perinatal, nutritional diseases, right? But it switches right around, and where we follow the funding is for diseases in the richest 20% of the global population, because that's what drives the funding, right? Now, the third question about justice has to do with the process of justice. Whose voice is heard when objections arises? Who can object to our intent in basic science? Who should? How should we have the fora? Artificial life or human embryos or animal research or dual-use technologies? This is an animal rights demonstration. Should it be stopped? Should it not? What does it mean to be a minority with a very strong opinion? What's the justice consideration for that? So those are just 3 examples of where justice theory has to be considered. How do we decide not only what's right, but what's fair? Okay? Now, why not just let the market decide? Well, it's kind of an amusing question exactly 1 year after the stock market completely fell apart, and we understood that sometimes markets don't level themselves and aren't the fairest scheme. But the problem is the goals and the process and the distribution of science all requires some thought. If you just let the market or the academic process decide scientific goals and process and distribution, what you always have is a fierce competition whose goal is a singular winner. And if there are losers, it doesn't really matter how many people don't get the Nobel Prize or don't get published, right, in any particular lab. There's no one having a global view unless we say a state has to look at it. So the problem is planning matters. Now, what are those? Any ideas about what those are? They are the not enough lifeboats of the Titanic. Right? Now, it seemed like letting the market decide was a really good idea. And it seemed like letting technology make the decision for the passengers seemed like a reasonable idea. It's just that it doesn't work out that way in real life, right? There's lifeboat number 6, half full, as you might add, from the Carpathian rescue ship. Okay. Now, first premise. Scientific attention, not money, attention, is one of humanity's single most precious social goods. When you have scientists determined to solve a problem, when you have the best and the brightest minds in San Diego, in La Jolla, thinking about something, odds are very good that the cloud will in fact come up with a solution. It's one of our most precious resources, is this scientific attention, okay? Premise 2, because it's a public good and our single most important asset, the funding of science should be publicly done. It ought not belong, because it's so important and so precious, to any one company, or even one university. It should be a wider public good, and therefore it would have oversight that's public, and it would be transparent, and the ownership of the things it produces and sharing are all enhanced if it is publicly funded. Okay? Third premise. Any objections so far? You got me on one, you got me on two? Right. As a social good, and not a thing, not a commodity, not something to be exchanged in the marketplace, science needs a fair context in which to proceed. And what I mean that is the sphere of the market is very powerful and oftentimes a good way to regulate things. But there are other spheres that are also important. Because science is a social good and not a thing, it doesn't really fit quite precisely in the sphere of the market. Therefore, both the process, how we do the science, whose bodies we use, and the substance of the research, where it goes, what the goal is, and who gets distributed, needs to be fair. But then, of course, you could say, Zoloth, what do you mean by fair? OK, that sounds good, right? Nice liberal theory about what do you mean by fair? Who gets into that lifeboat? OK? So who should get into a lifeboat that's scarce if there's not very many of them? So this is normally how we think about it. Feel free to offer any other ideas, but these are the standard candidates. We could say, OK, there's 26 lifeboats. There is 142 people. Everybody gets, you know, a seat, and Leonardo DiCaprio gets to hang on to a piece on the end, right? You could, that's one way to do it. You just divide the goods actually completely equally by numbers. Now, one way to look at that is say, well, that's ridiculous, right? Partially because a half a lifeboat doesn't work, as in Leonardo DiCaprio, who needed a whole lifeboat, and part of it you have to have watched the movie Titanic obsessively with your teenage daughter to understand that reference, right? Partially it's because some things don't divide, and partially it doesn't work because Aristotle pointed out that equal cases should be treated equally, but cases with difference should be treated with attention to their differences. But what does difference mean? What should count? So need might count. We might say women and children need it more, or someone needs something more. We might say it should depend on how hard you work. And then other people say, well, you know, a lot of people work hard, right? In fact, it's probably true that the people who are teaching, you know, 8th grade in inner city high schools are working really, really, really hard as they possibly could, but somehow we're not rewarding them in the same sort of way as others. Maybe it should be social contribution. We tend to reward people based on their social contribution or our idea of what they contribute. They're worth it more for a surgeon. It should be, an argument is it should be what you deserve, what you merit. If you're a good person, if you've done good things in the world. We all feel satisfied when prizes are given. If a nice person gets an award, Elizabeth Blackburn, I think, good, she's so nice and she got the Nobel Prize. So there it goes, right? And then some people just say age. In America, we've made a lot of decisions about goods and services based on age. We say, well, it's for younger children, it's for older people, whatever. Now, you can choose any one of these ideas, and you could regulate that science, but behind that regulation of science and the choice of those principles would be a theory. And different theories, which we have to take a look at to have you make your decision about how to make science fair, choose different principles. But they all share one thing. They believe in principles that we think are important for any social contract. That's why we return to the principles of autonomy, informed consent, the ability to be a moral agent, right? So let's just go through a few principles, a few theories, okay? Because you're going to have to choose how you decide if you want science to be fair. And what, Zoloth, do you mean by fair? Well, one way to think about what's fair is to be a libertarian. Now, libertarian theory has a lot going for it. First of all, it comes directly from the theory of John Locke. It comes directly from Adam Smith. It comes directly from Jefferson, who channels those people to say property matters. I'm a hardworking scientist, let's say, and I take raw material. I take genetic information. I take coordinates of genome mapping. And I work long hours in my lab. I mix my labor power, kind of like sweat equity, with HeLa cells, for instance, and I make a product, and the product is mine. I could share it, I could sell it, I could donate parts of it, for instance, right? The guy who invented polio vaccine, he gave that away. No patent, no nothing. But it's mine, and I have ownership rights over what I make. And the best way to do it is to rely on the compassion and decency of science to make their own decisions. But the question is that true? When I'm an organic gardener, and I have a big garden, but I'm a Californian, right? I was born to a Californian. My father taught me how to raise tomatoes, even in the harsh Chicago winters. The land that you have, what you start out with is also a product of your background, your training, your information. The land that I have in California doesn't even quite belong to me. It probably belonged to some Ohlone Indian or something. And also, if you're going to give scientists the power to use anything they have, to make anything they want, it might turn out fair or it might not. Because the goal of libertarian justice and fairness isn't the greatest good for the greatest number. It's maintaining the individual property of the person with power. Now, you might say that's a bad idea, because we want a good end. We want the greatest good for the greatest number, and therefore you'd have a theory called utilitarianism, and you'd think here of John Stuart Mill, and you'd think is the main thing should be a consequence. Let's set up our science so it's the greatest good for the greatest number. Now here, you don't have any rights as a scientist at all in particular. The only right you have, and everyone in the room has, is the same right. We want to live in a well-regulated society where it turns out greatest for the majority. And that seems like a good theory of justice. But the trouble is, no other claims would really matter. And this is because the problem is that a minority could exist who felt really oppressed by this decision. And we saw that in stem cell research. Catholic moral theology ended up being a minority position worldwide that said, don't do this in our behalf. And eventually, we had votes, and they got outvoted, right? And the question is, what about the individual? So notice that if you're going to choose a utilitarian scheme, there's going to be this trouble. So contract theory, here, I'm just going to go to the one that Rawls uses, is this idea that we can make a certain contract for a basic decent minimum. And the theory of contract theory is based on three premises. The idea of this justice theme is that you should give everybody as many rights as possible. Now, rights are a funny thing. I don't really have any rights, nor do you. You actually have no rights, unless we all feel a duty to defend your right. In other words, you might think you have a right to life, but she doesn't unless I have a duty not to kill her. You see how that works? It's correlative. Mike has a duty, has a right to be free, theoretically, but that's not a real right, his freedom, unless I have a duty not to enslave him. If I don't feel that I have any duty, and I can enslave him, as I do say to my graduate students, right? Then he doesn't really have a right. He can't really just walk out if I don't feel the duty. So this idea is, the first principle of a justice system is to figure out how to give people the most freedom they can, as long as it doesn't interfere with someone else's. And the second thing is, we live in an unfair world, but we're going to have to arrange the unfairnesses so that the least advantage would have the greatest benefit. And in Rawls, this theory says, if you took all of us in this room and you put a veil of ignorance over us, and you didn't know if you were going to be rich or poor in the system, if you were going to be a really good scientist, or you were going to be someone who really needed multiple sclerosis research, if you didn't know what your position was going to be, if you didn't know if you were going to be washing glasses or cleaning up the toilets in the labs or getting the Nobel Prize, you would set up a system of fairness that would make sure to keep the advantage to the person who'd be the most vulnerable. Okay? So that's a contract theory. The trouble with this is, this was how we came up with affirmative action, is that in fact, how long do you keep the system of adjustments in place? And finally, people aren't behind a veil of ignorance. When you set up a system for fairness in science, you know exactly what position you're in. So it creates a problem. And finally, it can create a new injustice, an unintended consequence. Egalitarian theories are often used, and they work because they're based on the principle that's really bootlegged from religious theory, which is that every single one of us really is equal. Every single one of us really has obligations and duties that are common to all, and none of us is really better than the other. Now, this is a tough idea to maintain, but the ability that rational choices can be made is how we set up, or how we did set up, many systems in healthcare. They're based on this idea of a basic decent minimum, and figuring out the share that everyone gets is important. That is, by the way, behind a lot of healthcare negotiations in the coming weeks, is what the basic decent minimum will be. And my question to you is, should you argue that there's a basic decent minimum in science as well? And what might that be? Now, all these different justice theories are good. We use them at all times, and we use different ones in different times. They all have to work. Any theory would be possible. It's all rooted in mortality and in scarcity, and they all can be made in a rational argument. All of these have been significantly challenged in the late 20th century, but these are the justice theories that we use to decide everything about healthcare reform and many things covertly about science. In science, I can tell you there is another theory that's also going on. When they discover something terrific, the first use is going to be very high risk and dangerous. The core justice question is it fair to test this risky, terribly risky thing on human populations? And who should get in line first? If you first test it on the poor, there'll be a justice problem. If you only allow access to the wealthy, there'll be a justice problem. And the first use will, when it gets figured out, it will only be available if the present funding continues to a small elite, but it will quickly become something, if it's good enough, a scientific advance, that all of us will feel entitled to. And then the question is, when does it shift from a risky treatment to something that a society has a duty to put out? Now, American policy is an organic policy, both in science and in healthcare. It's not systemic. We don't stop from the top and go backward. Things grow up driven by new technology and innovation, driven by the marketplace, and oftentimes our science is driven by the fact that we are a certain demographic, a baby boomer demographic, by changes. Our health is determined by demographic changes and food and immigration policies and transportation policy, and by histories of how we think about healthcare in war. And we've tried many different schemes. The main scheme we tried was in 1965, and we decided that people had to have healthcare, and most Americans were insured because of a deal that had been made in the 1940s when there was a freeze on wages. You all know this. So there was a freeze on wages. Big employers couldn't offer people during the war any more money to attract workers in wartime economy. There was a freeze on that. They had to give them something else to attract them. They decided to give them a raise, as it were, in the form of a benefit. So I don't know about you guys, but that has been in place in my university and in every trade union any unionized job I've ever worked in. I didn't get a raise last year. My academic salaries, they were all frozen. But Blue Cross Blue Shield got a raise. My employer gave them the raise that I would have gotten, right? Because their premiums went up and they get paid more. So it's all a part of your salary. If you're employed, part of your salary is given to you in your health care benefits. In 1965, most Americans had that plan. And then they stopped working and retired and died about 2 years later. What changed in our healthcare funding was big employers began to rise, both here and globally, that didn't offer healthcare benefits. So you could work full-time and not have healthcare benefits necessarily. There was a beta blockers, stents, cancer therapies, and lipid blockers changed when you died. So dying at 67 became increasingly, thank God, rare. People lived many, many years beyond that on their public option of Medicare. ICU transplants, many things changed. Small molecule drugs help, and people expected more. Unions were stronger in the past, but many forces coalesced to change this, and that's also, I think we turned out, that's also how we got to this situation. So I wanted to just go briefly. Let's see. We missed a case. We'll have to find that case later. All right. Let me just give you a controversial slide alert, okay? Because then we can go back and just show you one thing, which is, help. All right. Now I'm really lost. Okay. All right. All right. Before I do the next slide, I'm going to tell you, you may not agree with this. But I have a theory about healthcare that we're not discussing the right questions. We said yes to 4 things. We said yes to 4 things in our society. We said yes to 4 things in science. And we said yes to 4 things in healthcare. These are the 4 things we said yes to. To change science policy, to make it just, to make healthcare reform happen, will mean saying no to some parts of these things. Here are the things. We said yes to the fact that healthcare was going to be a very lucrative marketplace. We said that would be okay. We said that science should be big, should be really well funded. We gave big grants to scientists. We didn't do it to high school teachers. We did give it to scientists. That's a decision that was made. We said big lawsuits would be permitted. And therefore, big insurance would be needed against the big lawsuits. We said technology could get more and more and more expensive because it could be driven by the marketplace. Medicine became a very successful profit center. Big insurance companies made profits. Big HMOs made profits. Big scientists spun out separate centers and made company profits. Surgeons got paid lots and lots and lots of money. We said that was okay. In fact, many, many people who work in the healthcare industry make many times more than the President of the United States makes. They do it under the claim of doing something very socially useful, which I know is the case. And I also know that many people don't make a lot of money. But we did say yes to medicine and science as a marketplace. Secondly, we said yes to changing our bodies so that we could have anything, a kind of odd gluttony that created a lifestyle that made us ill, therefore driving the need for science to then fix that problem. 3 is we said yes to paying for many untested and competing choices of therapy without a central system of justice. So in different parts of the country, premature babies are treated differently. In different parts of the country, cardiac care is done differently. Yes?
Who is we?
Well,
you know what? I don't really remember anybody asking the public, do we really want all this junk food in our system? Do we really want it expensive? Who is the we?
I'm saying a generalized statement to we as a culture and a society, right? Right? We collectively. I feel like I helped collude in this because here I am trying to say these questions are wrong because we didn't elucidate these questions. I think we then participate in them. I don't believe it's done to us by anyone external. I think that we participate, we partake in a society in which we collectively exist in a society. Let's just take the agency part of it out. To say collectively, these things are things that are not opposed in any systematic way by any systematic institution within society or movement or party or whatever. So individuals may not like these things, but there's not a systematic no saying to this. Now, it might be something that we could start, but that would be starting it. We say yes to a rising sense of entitlement and to this notion of that we can be continually young, and probably most important here is there's been a loss of what was a central conversation intellectually in the universities and in the marketplaces of the Greek society, for instance, Hellenistic society, and surely most religious societies, taught one thing. The point of life for Aristotle and for Socrates, the point of life for many early historical traditions was to face death nobly. That was the point. Bravery, courage, allegiance, loyalty. to face death nobly was the intellectual task of an entire human life. And we became convinced that ought not be the case. U.V. Reinhardt, Stanford, has a great quote. He says, Americans think that death is optional. And therefore, our healthcare system is often devoted to this premise. And that whole business about the fear of the death panel and all that business was, it was so terrifying to think about actually paying a doctor to think about talking about that, that it was hard even to think about it. So I actually think saying medicine is great, science is great, but can only do so many things, that discussion, we avoided it. We avoid that. We do have a sense of when someone gets sick of wanting to feel like, how can we cure this? What's going to happen? We should have that. And if something blocks it, right, we feel not only sad, we feel like something has been taken from us, taken away from us, to which we are entitled. Now, I just think that these are, I'm just a country moral philosopher, but these are things I think that we have to take another look at. We have to decide, are these ethical? Could any of them be changed? And our colleague here has said, maybe, I don't even want this stuff, right? And here's the question. Does saying yes to fairness mean saying no to any of these earlier choices? Is it fair to fund research on disease triggered by culture? And here's the problem I want to state for you. I think this should be the problem of bioethics for the next 5 years. How do you set in place a fair and just system of access to the good ends of science research using a fair process and aiming at fair and just goals for all of humanity? That's a big challenge. I think it's much bigger than even the moral status of the human. We live in an unjust world. So I'm just going to end with letting it an open question. Some choices are easy because some choices seem pretty straightforward. But new science, when new science emerges, genuinely interesting new things emerge, what's basic, what's not? What if something is more expensive, but it's just better? Do we have room for that? So this was the other part. These slides got a little mixed up, but here's an example that I don't know the answer to. There's a high-tech intervention. The little device itself costs $10,000. Just the device, not the surgeon, not everything else. It can prevent fatal heart attacks. It's used in two categories of people. One is people who've had a first heart attack that's not fatal, that are at a higher risk for a second heart attack that will be fatal. If they get an implantable device, it would block the second attack. And the second category is people that have long QT syndromes, have a genetic disease that means that sometime in early adolescence, they can drop dead with no other symptoms. An ICD, an implantable device stimulation, would prevent that too. So all this talk about waste and all this talk about science, who should get it? How do you even test? How do you even set up a control? How do you do it fairly? And those are my three questions. Who is it tested on? How do you set up a trial? Who should get the good ends? Should you pay for it? Maybe we should just give it to everyone. We don't know who needs it and who doesn't, right? Maybe we should give it to everyone, or maybe we should test everyone to see if they're at risk for sudden cardiac death, or I'll go back to this earlier slides. You could maybe fund low-cost cardiac treatment centers in poor neighborhoods, right? Or a prenatal genetic test and counsel people not even to have children with that syndrome later in life. So these are not easy choices. On controversial research, all these questions that you've been taking up in the last 5 years, I think these are wonderful. But they're justice considerations in every single one of them. If you fund research on extending life, it's a justice question. If you create artificial life forms, for whose purpose, under whose control, it's a justice question. Justice, colleagues, is your challenge. Your participation is not just about, do I like it or do I not? Is it yucky or is it acceptable? It is to be responsible to the question of the suffering of the other. And that's a tough question. And thank you, because you're going to take it on.
So thank you very much, Laurie.
This is my lab,
and that's,
just like you guys all have.
And they all look happy despite the fact they're enslaved. We can see so.
They're
postdocs. They're postdocs.
Okay.
They have the doctorate.
Okay. So I suspected that we might have a little bit more, go a little bit longer than we had wanted, but that's okay because I knew that it was going to be fantastic material, and it really is at the core of what we've been talking about for the Ethics Center.